Okay, so today I got Andrew Paul. He's currently director of performance and rehab for OKC. Am I miss? Oh, and we have like a lot of mutual friends. Shout out to Brett. Shout out to like Pat. So, I know you came from Exos. So there's a lot like Victor Hall, Dennis Logan, like we mentioned before.
Yeah.
And like, am I missing anything?
No, I mean the all those people are from kind of different places, but I've been in OKC for this is I think going on year 10 coming up. And then prior to this, like you said, I was at Exos where I worked with Victor and Dennis. Then prior to that, where I started my career was with Pat Ivy at Louisville. So I was at Missouri with him.
Yeah.
He's at Louisville now, but I was with him for probably my first 7 years of my career. So I was very fortunate to be working under him for a long period of time.
Yeah, all those guys are legend, man. All those guys are legend.
No, one thing I've been intentional about is making sure I'm next to and around people like that when I take jobs and when I move from place to place. So I've been lucky.
Yeah, and congrats on like winning the NBSCA Strength Coach of the Year. Am I correct?
Oh yeah, appreciate that, man. That's an award that the coaches vote, the strength coaches vote on. So I was honored to be voted. Um, but it's a really good group of guys to be voted for, and also to win competing against those people is pretty unbelievable. So I was honored. Eric Ferran from the Miami Heat won this year, so I won for 2 seasons ago. He won for this year, and that was like very well deserved on his part. He's done a really good job for a long time. So Eric Ferran is the strength coach of the year for 2023 2024.
Cool, cool. Actually, I'm gonna talk to him like in a few weeks. That was all. It's gonna be awesome.
Oh, really? He's a
Yeah,
great dude. He's a great
nice.
dude.
Cool, cool. So, first of all, like I know we kind of talk about like this topic before the season ends, but like, uh, and shout out to Brian Mann. He kind of brought this up like when I was in the States. So, can you all like share a little bit your thoughts on like maybe what it is it like divided into like what's so called fascia based athlete or like muscle based athlete?
Yeah. So I'll just kind of share our thoughts on this topic. I think there's a lot of people that have similar but maybe different ideas of what these things are. Um, but I'll just describe how we tend to describe it, and our thoughts are always kind of evolving um, as we go. But in our system, we discuss people in terms of we discuss the concepts of propulsion and absorption. And for us, absorption is something that happens to you when a force is imposed upon you, and propulsion is something that is happening when you produce the force yourself. So we discuss those in like a lot of different layers. One of the layers is just the position, the sequence of joint actions that takes place when you're absorbing force, and the sequence of joint actions that take place when you produce force or propel. So that's one way you can look at it. Another way you can look at it is that, or that we look at it is that there is certain athlete types, archetypes, you might say, that tend to excel or bias towards producing force or creating momentum, and there's certain athlete archetypes that are excel or bias towards performing better when forces are imposed upon them or when momentum's already present. And so other people have called that fascial. The absorption is fascial or elastic. Our propulsive is muscular, usually called muscular. I've heard mechanical before too. So I think these conversations are being had by a lot of smart people, a lot of different places and different contexts. Um, we'll add a lot of layers to them as far as we talk about the joint actions that are taking place, the forces that are taking place, and then there's within each one of those absorption and repulsion archetypes, there's sub archetypes that this is an absorption style athlete, but this is this type of absorption style athlete, and same thing with propulsion. So the important thing to remember with these that I always have to remind our staff and we talk about is that there are strengths and weaknesses to just about every movement style you can think of. Whereas one movement style is excels in certain activities or certain tasks on the court. For us, it's basketball. We talk about it in. There's also things that that archetype might struggle with inherently just by the nature of who they are. Um, and so we talk a lot about those when it comes to athlete development because part of athlete development is understanding what you're dealing with. Um, Likewise, based on where they're at on that spectrum, there's certain um, injuries that I won't say injuries, but there's certain areas of their body they're more predisposed to stress than others. And that's important to understand too when you put together a program. So, like I said, we have layers to it, but I think it's being talked about by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. Um, and that's generally it's a 10,000 foot overview of how we view those concepts.
Cool. So, when you talk about you kind of categorize like athlete into like different subtype, like how many like subtypes do you guys categorize it?
So we have, I would say four. I think you could have an infinite number of things. I think that I've seen players that have qualities of a lot of different things, and I'm always learning. One of the reasons we have four is because we've had athletes that taught us a lot. And what the way I describe this to people is when you look at absorption and propulsion, not only is it two different movement styles, it's also a description of the gait cycle. And in the gait cycle, this is where it originally comes from, is when you're in early stance or you're heel striking with your foot in front of you, from heel strike all the way to mid stance. So my right heel hits in front of me and I roll all the way to my right midfoot. My body's over my midfoot. We call that phase absorption. And once you hit midfoot and then you're pushing through toe off, we call that propulsion. And the reason why we do that is because again, there's joint actions associated with that. But um, the where this connects to movement styles is that, or subcategories, I should say, is that muscular athletes tend to operate right in the middle of where absorption meets propulsion, in that middle ground. And the reason why muscular athletes tend to operate there is because when your weight is over your midfoot and gait, it's the area of the highest force output. So it's the area where you're most prepared to handle force. Um, and there's certain joint actions that are associated with that position. Elastic athletes tend to operate on the periphery, where the force output is probably less. So when you're at heel strike on your right side, the force demands in the body are not high going up through that right limb, and then on toe off, when you're toeing off that right side, the force demands are not high. So those are two different to us. Those are two different types of elastic people. Um, in in one case, you have an elastic athlete who is, on that is, we call it rear foot dominant. That's someone who's like you might say more associated with like that heel strike position. Um, and they have a set of skills that's very specific to them. And they usually have a very specific presentation that's associated with them. And then you also have a set of athletes and elastic athletes that is more biased towards the toe off position. And they have a set of skills that's specific to them and a set of presentations around muscle tissue that's kind of specific to them. And then usually the muscular group is, like I said, centered in that margin between absorption and propulsion. Um, and um, they have a set of skills that are advantageous for them and a set of muscular positioning that you need to think about. So we have two types of elastic people, rear foot and forefoot, and this is just how we describe it. There's a million different ways you can talk about it. Um, and then you have in the middle, you have propulsive athletes, and then we basically decide that they're going to be either a true hardcore propulsive person. This is usually a power lifter. We don't see a whole lot of that in in basketball. There's some that drift that way, and then we call it a stiff muscular. These are muscular people that tend to be midfoot dominant, and it's characterized usually by a faster and shorter um, counter movement on their counter movement jump. So they excel in midfoot positions. Their counter movement depth is very short. It's fast, and they tend to be a lot stiffer mostly knee stiffness, but they're utilizing different stiffness than a true propulsive person would be. So that's four. You have rear foot, forefoot elastic, and then we have a true propulsive and a more stiff propulsive. And then from there, you could probably talk about anyone being any combination of those four. Um, and so you have an infinite number. And the reason why we have to categorize that to make it simple is because it helps us understand kind of the route we're going to take with a player in terms of injury mitigation plans, exercise selection, and it's just a language by which we can have a conversation more so. Like the players, our players don't know at all about us discussing things like that.
Yeah,
Like they will know if I say, I view your strengths as this and your weaknesses as this. I'm speaking to them the archetype I believe they are, and they'll usually agree with that. But they don't know the terminology, and nor do they even care. It's more for staff to have a discussion about how we want to handle these like different problems that arise.
cool, cool. So, I know we kind of talked about SFMA last time, and I'm passionate about it, but I'm gonna like ask it a little bit later. I'm gonna start with, so for those four type of athlete, like when they do a counter movement jump on force plate, is there gonna be differences?
Yeah. And I'm not, the output measures to me aren't what I'm looking at. Usually it's strategy. So the differences are strategy. And when their strategy is different, their force velocity curves will be different. Um, so I have a hard time when people present on what the optimal curve should be because we're looking at a very specific set, like a very specific test in a very specific conditions. And those conditions are usually feet flat in the ground. And there are certain athletes that are much better suited to perform with their feet flat in a static start than others. Those are typically muscular propulsive athletes. I was an Olympic weightlifter. I fall in that category. I'm much more comfortable with a flat foot start position than like a run up start. So the strategies are usually as follows. Um, for a true propulsive athlete, they will not unweight very much. So I'm not going to get into the terminology of a counter movement jump. I'm assuming most people kind of understand what that is. There's not a lot of unweighting, and the reason is that their eccentric or their counter movement portion is usually deeper and slower. And so they really want to get into a low counter movement in order to exploit their concentric impulse, right? And these people are using really concentric impulse dominated strategies. That's true propulsion. Um, you know, I think P3 calls these force movers, right? They have a term for it. Oddly enough, force movers are really good at vertical jump height. We look at vertical jump as being um, a marker of athleticism. The problem is in their research over the last 30, I don't want to speak for them, but I've had these conversations with them before. The people that fall into the force mover category are the least likely to have success in the NBA of anything they've collected. And the reason for that is that when you use really deep counter movement strategies in a sport like basketball, this is not the same for football. This is not, I'm not speaking for any other sport. The chances of your athleticism actually making it into the game is very low. So there are times when you can get a much higher jump height, impressive concentric impulses, and actually be worse on the court as an athlete. So like, and this is when you push people towards this strategy, that's what you're going to get. That's just me. Olympic weightlifters are concentric impulse mass, like just kings. It's all the whole sport is. So um, that's the propulsion side. A stiff muscular, a stiff propulsive is kind of similar to that. The only difference is they're much better at using counter movement strategies to get in there. And so their counter movement depth is a lot shorter. Their eccentric velocity is higher, but they're still generating high concentric impulses. This is an advantageous strategy for some skill sets in basketball. Again, I won't speak for any other sport. It's advantageous strategy for some skill sets in basketball. Rim protection is one of them. Um, because you can jump as high as you want with a propulsive jump, if you're not quick into it, it's not going to matter. Regardless of jump height, it's not going to matter because you have to anticipate way too much. So elite rim protectors in the NBA have a stiffer a stiffer strategy, and it's usually a combination of their standing reach, and how quickly they get off the ground, not necessarily how high they get off the ground. So, um, stiff muscular are still pretty impressive. Their jump height may not be as impressive as a true propulsive person, but their speed at which they get off the ground is really good. Both of those styles will excel in a static vertical jump. When you get into the other two types, um, the strategies change a bit. Usually, a rear foot dominated elastic person will have some kind of spiraling action when they when they uh when they jump. Their force at minimal displacement or force at zero velocity is usually can be less, and the reason is that these people tend to utilize rotation a lot more. And so they're more likely to look like they have knock knees at the bottom of their jump. They have a really difficult time keeping their hands in their hips if you do it that way. And if you let them use an arm swing, they're not going to swing their arms front to back. They're going to swing them in a big, in almost like two circles, like they have wings. And the reason is that they are using spiraling action through their limbs to get themselves going. They tend to have aberrant motions in their braking phase more so than other athletes, and that's because of the internal rotation moments they're using to generate force. So their curve isn't as smooth in the braking phase. In a true counter movement jump, they'll excel with forward momentum. That when they're standing still, that can be tough for them. Um, they tend to have braking curves that are like you look at it and like something's not right there. Like it's not like it's like very wavy, and that's usually a rear foot person that's trying to use spirals to jump. 4 foot people have the most trouble, I think. 4 foot elastic have the most trouble with their force plate jumps. They tend to land and almost fall off the front of the force plate a lot. Their center of gravity likes to be in front of themselves. Um, they're definitely not getting deep counter movements. Their performance in those tests usually aren't that great. Um, and so they have a very unique, it's just a test that doesn't suit well for their skill set. Um, Much better if they get like a depth jump is much more in their wheelhouse to show their athleticism. So all four of those have different strategies. You can usually look at a force plate curve and decide kind of what their strengths and weaknesses might be.
Nice, nice. So, for those like four types of athlete, we kind of discussed like what are we seeing on the force weight. So if it's on the table, like we talk about doing table stretch or SFMA, is there like certain things you're gonna look at for each type?
Yeah, I think that I've spoken on this before. The way, in my opinion, in the setting I'm in, which is the NBA, which is a very specific setting, um, learning kind of what you're doing on the table with your movement screens, it has to be very precise. And so not everyone's going to have a 3 on an FMS straight leg race. It's unrealistic. It's not how high level athletes behave. And so understanding what you're looking at and why is the key. So I'm trying to figure out which one to talk about first. I'll start with rear foot elastic because I think they're the most obvious. So, and I want to describe what this is to me. So I kind of described a little bit of it. People that are rear foot elastic um, are really, really good with their feet out in front of their center of gravity, out in front of their body. So these are the people that when you're watching them, they have horizontal momentum, they're running towards the rim, and they're going to take off. They do a penultimate step, and they're going to jump from there. And what you're going to see is their foot land in a heel strike far in front of their torso. And when that happens, if you freeze frame it, their torso is almost erect and their heel is driving into the ground in front of them, and while their body's kind of going over the top. And once that happens, it starts like a spiraling cascade where they actually move into a tripod. They go pigeon-toed, their knees come in, their body turns to the side, and then they leap. Ja Morant's a great example. There's some slow-mo videos of him doing this, but that's the sequence that happens. He takes a penultimate, his feet land in front of him. It's a rear foot strike first. Um, as his body transfers over, his other leg comes around, goes pigeon-toed, his knees come in, his shoulder turns towards the basket, and he goes. These are athletes that use rotation to a significant degree. They tend to have a lot on the table of hip internal rotation. And from an SFMA standpoint, managing rotation is a big key. Both making sure they don't lose it throughout the course of the season and they have good control of it is the number one key. And the reason is that they're going to utilize this mostly in their lower extremities, and the two major checkpoints are usually hip and knee, at the tibia and at the hip. Um, so that's rear foot. Those are spiral people. And they use spirals in almost everything they do. It's really hard for them to stay sagittal. Um, the next their deep squat is also a good indicator only because people that do a good job of keeping their body relatively backwards in their stance, like with their center of mass is on the rear foot, they tend to be able to squat deeper. So this group is usually of the elastic group. This is the one that tends to look like they're better movers, tend to be more mobile. The other group is the forefoot group, and they're the opposite. They are the elastic people that like you're like, you know, if you ever, I think I've said this before, if you did an FMS and a forefoot person, they would fail every test. They have exceptional muscle tone, specifically in their posterior chain and into their plantar fascia. And the reason this is a huge archetype in the track and field world, especially sprinters, these are the people you see when you look at their feet and their toes are real crunched together, and they usually have a little hallux valgus where they're crossing over. And the reason why that is these people live and die on their forefoot, and their plantar fascia is a major driver of that. And it gets real tight and tense and pulls things together. And it can be a superpower for someone that wants to sprint. Um, and I've used this before. LeBron James. Just I've never obviously never worked with him, but like looking at pictures of his feet and watching how the way he plays the game, he falls in this archetype to some degree because all the dunks you talk about this guy are not these winding spiral dunks. These are one-legged takeoffs from a running start, tomahawk dunks that are more horizontal projection than vertical projection dunks. Even in games, he'll kind of slow play his half of the court, and then when you see him, he'll kind of take off down the middle of the lane to make a play. So he utilizes his IQ and that movement style to his advantage in those situations. So this is a movement style that's built for horizontal projection. The issues that come along with that are, like I said, posterior chain tone. And so managing straight leg raise is a key. These people will never be the 90-degree straight leg raise people. They're probably people that you're like, Jesus, this is like, the worst straight leg raise I've ever seen. But there's going to be a bandwidth of normality for them that you need to identify. And because when they're stressed in the course of a season, they're going to collect tone in the calf, plantar fascia, and hamstring. Um, so when I call up when we stretch guys in their warm up, part of that is checking is making sure there's a natural organic way where I'm checking and screening these things without making it weird for the player, where they just feel like that's kind of part of their flow. And so doing a hamstring PNF on someone like this is a great way to make sure you're dialing in, feeling small differences in range of motion while also like taking into account that's you're not going to fix that, but you can manage it. Um, those are the elastic guys. They're a little bit easier to talk about. The muscular athletes, the important thing about them is that when you're relying on um, a huge propulsive impulse to move your body, what you need to make sure is you have extension. Because if you can think about a true propulsive athlete, they're going to go low into their counter movement, and they're really not relying on that counter movement to generate much energy. What they're actually relying on is a massive push um, through extension. So extension of the knee, extension of the hip. Generally, for our athletes, I'm managing extension of the hip. What will happen if you don't manage extension of the hip? These people is they have a mechanical disadvantage when they propel, and so they tend to have soft tissue strains in the backside because they're lacking movement on the front side. A hamstring pull is a great example of a muscular, kind of hard running person who doesn't have good lumbopelvic stability and hip extension. So they really need the extension system to be in check. Um, Otherwise, they're going to have problems. So that's kind of how we view it. Obviously the SFMA is all encompassing. There's just certain parts of it you want to dial in for certain people, more so than others. Not to say that anything else is being totally ignored, but those are the things that when I see a rear foot person that is losing significant amounts of IR at the hip or knee, like I'm addressing that immediately to make sure that that's a sign that there's excessive stress that they're not recovering from.
Cool, cool. So, uh, I know, like, we also kind of talked about this before, but like, for like these type of like these four type of athlete, or like people categorize it like fascia based or muscle based. Tend to have like different weakness or like different strengths. So, um. How do you like, I know this is a big one, but like how do you decide, or like how do you like train, when to train their weakness, when to train their like like yeah, their strength?
I think there's a lot of factors for that. I think one of them is where we're at in the season, where they're at in their career. Um, there are certain players that if everyone likes to think about the superstars. I would say a vast majority of the players in the NBA are in a position where if they don't improve in certain things, they may not be around very long. So that's a major factor in what we do. Um, we have to recognize that some things are going to be more difficult than others for them to be able to accomplish, and you have to be, tiptoe with our volumes. But there's a lot of factors in that. There are certain times of the year where when I look at our calendar at the beginning of the year, I mark certain periods where I want to be more aggressive, both in frequency of loading, volume, but also exercise selection. There's certain periods of the year when I want to be very, very conservative, um, and in all categories, volume, frequency, and in exercise selection. Um, and so, whatever that means for that person, aggressive means something different for an established veteran than it means for a rookie that is maybe a second round pick or something of that nature. So. Um, and we want to have a realistic conversation about the developmental plan and what this person can realistically achieve as an athlete. And all those things dictate how aggressive we want to be. If I don't want to be aggressive at all, I'm probably going to lightly feed in some things that make them good. I'm going to mitigate the effects of some of the things we just talked about, and go from there. If there's something I want to be really aggressive with, then training away and trying to develop some qualities they might not be good at is something we'll go hard at. Um, just knowing that there when you get aggressive with something like that, and you're taking an elastic person and you're really driving home some propulsive qualities, there's going to be a cost to be paid. Much like if you took a power lifter and did a bunch of plyometrics out of nowhere, there would be a cost to be paid for that. So like we have to keep that in mind. But I think there's a lot of factors that determine that. Probably one of the number one questions I get is, do you go with it or go away from it? I think I think you can do any. That's the fun part about coaching is you look at the athlete for the situation they're in. You have conversations with the developmental staff on what we view this person as. Have conversation with the player about what they value and what they want to get done. That's a big one. And then you make those decisions from there.
Cool, cool. So, uh, like you mentioned, or we talked a little bit before, during the season, it's about like managing stiffness. So let's say, and we also talk about like if your athlete getting for fatigue, probably one of the first thing you'll see is like they kind of like lose their range of motion for their hip internal rotation or external rotation. So managing all of those for like let's say for those stiffer athlete for like what's so called like the front foot dominant or like rear foot dominant. Am I using it right?
Yeah, works for me.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
I'm not still stringent on the language. I know what you're saying. I'm trying to use the language to describe my thoughts on things, but I mean, there's a number of different ways you can describe these things. So I got you.
so managing stiffness for like these stiffer guys. How would you like, especially during the season, like, is there ways to like get them like, or like help them gain their range of motion back?
Well, yeah, I think so. To address your point about accruing stiffness in a sport like basketball, if you let things be, these players will accrue wild amounts of stiffness and rigidity, particularly when they're playing 4 games a week for 6 months. Um, and part of that is a stress response, part of that is an adaptation to the sport. Um, so ensuring that you're understanding what's going on there is really important. Now, caveat on stiffness, it can be like a superpower for someone. A lot of training techniques that are meant to increase someone's vertical jump or sprint speed are meant to generate stiffness. Flip side, stiffness has been linked to soft tissue injuries, been linked to bony injuries, tendinopathies, and ligament ruptures. So like there's very clearly up and downside to accruing stiffness. Um, in my context in the NBA, I'm already dealing with a very specific type of player. My job in the season is to manage stiffness, not to increase it. That's just my take. Um, the people might argue with me, but what I've seen in the course of my career during a competitive professional season with established high level players is that they're going to accrue what I would consider to be like, I want to say pathological, like there's a disease going on there, but like pathological stiffness in that this is stiffness that's not helping their performance. It's actually a response to stress that's in a negative way. Now you can handle that a lot of different ways. You can use manual skills, and I'm a physical therapist by nature, so or by trade. So um, if I deem that to be a specific tissue that's an issue, we can go at it from a tissue, whether it's needling, ART, whatever your freaking deal is. Um, if it's a joint issue where there's particularly propulsive athletes tend to accrue stiffness in more articular stiffness in joints. Um, you have methods that go about that. You can also do it in the weight room. One of the ways you drive up stiffness. So if I really want to create stiffness, I would do things like overcoming isometrics in a half squat position or a quarter squat position. I would do things like moving exceptionally heavy loads. I would do plyometrics. So you can use methods to drive up stiffness. Likewise, there are methods that we know decrease stiffness. Um, a lot of the research on tendon health is on slow moving, full range, eccentric concept, really slow actions. Long term yielding isometrics seem to be better than overcoming, depending on who you talk to at what time. Um, those are things that are meant to decrease stiffness, and that's why they work. And so we know in one sense we can go for really high force output and we can drive up stiffness, but we can also change the way in which we load players to decrease the stiffness they're encountering and allow them to disperse forces a little bit. Um, so I think there's a number of ways which you can go about it. It's just my take, and certainly there's an argument against me on this. It's just something that I've learned that they're naturally going to accrue stiffness over the course of the season. My job as a strength coach is not to encourage that, but to mitigate it and allow them to be on the court as much as they can. And so I'm really trying to manage that more than I am trying to create it.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like our industry is kind of like still more towards like the direction is still like towards probably creating stiffness, building the power output. But like for I don't know, even when I work with track athletes, they're meant to be like strong, fast, like too much power output. Sometimes they still can't handle that.
And track's an interesting sport, man, because they're going to compete hard. Track, you can go. I can have a lot of things about track because I really like track. I think it's like one of the best places to study because they're either better or they're worse. There's no argument there. It's like the time is the time. But like they're not competing often. And it's one of the unique things about the NBA is that the amount of travel we do throughout the course of a week, amount of games we play throughout the course of the week, and the duration of the season are pretty extreme. College basketball is going to play twice a week for 3 months. We're going to play 4 times a week for 6 months. Track is going to have a serious competition once every 3 to 4 weeks in their period. They might compete once a week, but they're going to have a real serious one they're trying to peak for once twice a week. And their events aren't very long. And so I know whenever I said it to a track person, they're like, "What we that's not true at all." I'm like, "Well, you run 100 meters. If I'm running the 100 meters and I want to peak for a day, then output is going to be a major part of my program." That's not the case for now. You can also flip that on its own side and say, of all the research on what makes you fast at running 100 meters, the number one thing that gets you faster is running 100 meters as fast as you can. So, um, at some point in time, the strength coach's job is there to make sure that you can compete in the 100 meters as much as physically possible, and nothing else to take away from that. I view basketball very similar to that. Is that the job of a strength coach in season in the NBA is to keep the players competing in basketball as much as they possibly can. That is everything else is so secondary that um, it's not even worth in a lot of cases not really worth the squeeze. Um, so I agree that output is a major push. I think part of the problem in the industry is I've said this before is that it's so easy to measure that nowadays with we have a Kangatech in our weight room. People use belt squats, isometric mid thigh pulls, counter room jumps. All of these are major output measuring sticks. And we forget that a part of the equation is also their ability to buffer and disperse forces. And that requires a lack of stiffness. That requires you to control your stiffness. And this is a whole separate topic of a conversation that could go on for a while, but I have several examples of this um, where it's just my take that of all the work our players do, probably 10% of it is really output driven work, and 90% of it is work to manage tissue stiffness, joint stiffness, body control, things of that nature to allow them to disperse forces they're going to counter on the court. And, um, you know, I, that's just where I stand right now. And like, I just I haven't seen injury rates change. If anything, they've gotten worse since the advent of a lot of this technology. And so I just haven't been convinced that going after more peak forces on things is like the best way to go about things in season.
Yeah, agree. Especially when we come from like PT background like you or like SFMA background like me. Like I tend like at this point in my career I tend to not like really want to focus too much on increasing their power output, but like managing their like range of motion, helping them move better on the court. That's my goal right now.
But what I will acknowledge is there's some athletes that if they really want to hang in the NBA, they need to improve some things. I'm down with that. Generally, that's not the case though. Generally, when I'm weighing risk reward with those with players, I would say almost all the players on our roster fall in a different category than that. Here's an interesting thing to think about. So like maybe it is my PT background, but I'm exposed to more of the medical community than a lot of people in the strength and conditioning community are. And Brian Mann, you mentioned Brian Mann earlier. So Brian
Yeah.
Mann's my guy. He's like, we worked together at Mizzou. He was my strength coach when I was a collegiate athlete. Um, like he's a good friend of mine. Like I just have a lot of respect for his work. So he's one end of the spectrum. Velocity-based training is his baby for the last 20 years. Dr. Ebony Rio, who maybe some people don't know, some people do, is a protege of Jill Cook. And Ebony Rio is a physio. And while Jill Cook is kind of the researcher of the two, Ebony Rio is much more of a practical, applied physical therapist, physio. So the reason why I'm bringing these two people up is Brian Mann is a velocity-based training researcher. All his books I was on the cover of his very first, like me lifting was on the cover of his very first velocity-based training book. I had hair at the time. That's how long ago this was. Now, Ebony Rio is a tendon health expert, and she'll speak on tendon health, and that's like her jam. What she will say about the number one way to screw up a tendon is to combine load and speed.
Oh yeah.
So like what she's saying is plyometrics by themselves may not be bad. Where people really get screwed up is when they're doing things like jump squats, where they're having heavy loads in their back and trying to move it as fast as they can. That's how they're causing the most connective tissue damage and tendinopathy. And so she's proposing like slow, isometrics obviously, and then really slow controlled movements. Um, in the weight room, we were talking about a 4 second eccentric and 3 second concentric, which is like exceptionally slow. These are two, and B Man's proposing high velocity, high intent things. And the reason is that they're valuing something different. Both of them are 100% correct in what they're saying. I don't think either one of them um, are saying like any falsehoods, but what they're measuring is different things. And so and they're not disagreeing with one another. They're just looking at things through a different perspective. In B Man's case, if you use velocity based training, yeah, you're like if I'm going to train someone for the combine, I want them to move some stuff fast, and I want to increase their motor and get that engine big. But if I'm training someone for throughout the course of an NBA season, I may be thinking more like Ebony Rio. But the fact that they have two such polar opposite opinions on how best to manage things in the weight room, even though they're clearly looking at it from different angles, it's a good indicator that maybe going after high outputs, like there's a flip side to high output. High output comes with a cost, and maybe we're not taking that into account as much. So
Yeah, yeah. I agree. Oh, this made me thought the reason why we talk about this is because like manual stiffness is because I was asking you about like what's the difference between combine prep and in-season work. Yeah, I remember that. Nice.
yeah, and that is the like if if your sport is your output, then like I would train for output and I'd prioritize that. Our sport is not, and it's geared around getting on the court. And I mean, there's nothing you're gonna do in our weight room that is gonna produce more power output or speed or elasticity than what they're doing on the basketball court on game night. It's not even close. And so like um recognizing the body's already encountering that is a big part of it. Um, but then just at least acknowledging some of these things that we may not understand yet about what happens when when you're driving velocity and load together and high force outputs and all this stuff. What adaptations are going to take place in the body because of that, and is that helpful or is that not?
Yeah, yeah. I like it. I like it. I like it. So enough for the elastic or like fascia-based, muscle-based athlete. The other topic I want to like kind of discuss is like besides like SFMA or FMS, like I know you probably spend a lot of time watching how athletes move, and there's like rarely people like categorize like how athletes should move or like how their body like is there like some key point we're gonna look at when athlete moves. So besides like those like static movement testing, is there things you're gonna look at when like when we do movement analysis, watching or just observing athlete move on the court?
Yeah, I'm much more of a watcher. I'm older now, so I'm in my 40s. So I'm like, there's a lot of technology coming out now that I'm just like, I find myself, I feel like I'm that older strength coach that was I would look at when I was younger and be like, oh, he's old school or whatever. But I feel like if you really take time and observe things, and just watch unbiased, you'll be able to see a lot more than trying to look at everything through a data sheet or a computer screen. Um, that's just me. Now I might be out of the business here soon because I'm too old, but it's what it is. But so generally, what I'm looking at is I want to know their movement strategies from a dead stop, and I want to see their movement strategies when they're already on the move. Um, there are certain, particularly like forefoot elastic athletes. If you watch them, they are very uncomfortable with their feet stopping still, and so they tend to. I always say they have happy feet. They kind of bounce around a lot. Um, when they initiate movement, whether it's in transition, they tend to initiate with a little bit of a hop in them and take off. So small things like that give you a good idea. Um, muscular athletes, particularly stiff muscular, are very, very good at moving from a dead stop. And they get their feet settled. These are really good defenders on the perimeter. They get their feet settled and they can really glide nicely and push from there. Um, so watching how they initiate movement and then watching how they respond on a move is two different things. One of the hard parts, one of the downsides of being like a stiff muscular is that you really have a hard time putting the brakes on when you're moving fast forward. You can stop a lot better moving laterally. And the reason why they tend to stop, in my opinion, why they tend to stop better laterally is that when you stop in a shuffle, you're stopping right into your midfoot. Like it's literally like your foot lands flat and you're already in your midfoot. And so it's really easy to stop when you're moving laterally. When you're running forward hard, they tend to have a hard time putting the brakes on and tend to just kind of like take off. It's not like a good, they tend to either come to a complete stop and jump off 2 feet. Um, but they can't access rear foot. Power lifters or like Olympic lifters, if you ever watch them do like a running start, like just a running box jump, it's hilarious. I do it. They'll almost come to a complete stop. They'll do like a penultimate and it's like a slow gather. And it's like, all right, now I can actually jump from here. That's typically how they do things. And the reason why they have a hard time accessing rear foot. And so when you're running forward, you can't get on your midfoot super easily without stumbling. So um, I spend a lot of time watching how they gather themselves, how they initiate movement, and how they handle things when they're moving in different directions. Um, a lot can be said just by watching them. I think rear foot elastics are really fun to watch because they stay behind themselves. They have great brake systems. They tend to be really good dynamic ball handlers and can get some step backs. They also tend to be people that don't necessarily like lifting weights all that much because um, the positions required to get into a rear foot position are the antithesis of what it takes to lift weights heavy. So mainly I'm talking about in the pelvis and up the chain is like yeah, so that so um a lot of it can become can you can watch just you can observe and just see what their strengths and weaknesses are and where they excel and um yeah I try to view that through a lens. I try to watch them playing basketball and view it through a lens of like what is a tactical decision they're moving like this because for tactical reasons versus they're moving this because this is the way they do things.
Cool. So this kind of like made me think about like ACL injury and like Achilles tendon injury. And this I started by like noticing these because uh Franz Bosch kind of talk about it, and now I know like there's paper about like Achilles tendon and ACL. Shout out to Adam Petwick.
Mhm.
So uh so for Franz Bosch, I'm just gonna use his language. Like so he kind of said like when you go into like deep dorsiflexion, like it's gonna get easier to like rupture your tendon, Achilles tendon in
Mhm.
some cases. So for like those like front foot L or yeah, forefoot dominant or like muscle based athlete, is that the case for Achilles tendon? Are they or are muscle based athlete more easily go to those positions, deep dorsiflexion?
Yeah, I think so. I won't be able to speak specifically on what the incidence differences is in injuries. I will say that um, propulsive athletes typically rely more on range of motion to get their job done. So they're typically better in things like deep squatting. They typically have more range of motion, and they makes them susceptible to soft tissue like muscle strains, but not necessarily tendon ruptures. Um, so generally speaking, like a truly muscular person would likely have some guarding against a tendon rupture, just from a movement strategy standpoint. Forefoot elastics are the opposite of what you're talking about. They're probably accrued a great degree of stiffness, both like neuromuscular stiffness from like a movement strategy standpoint, but also like mechanical stiffness. And so when they're put in a position to have a great degree of dorsiflexion under load, which is like a plyo step is what Lee Taft might call it, where they step back to go forward. Um, the likelihood of getting an extreme amount of excessive motion there that's beyond the capability of tendon is probably a lot higher. Um, those are people where I think it's crucial to manage the plantar fascia. It's crucial to manage the posterior chain. Um, it's you really want to maximize um, you really want to maximize their dorsiflexion ability to recognizing that you're not going to make this person like a they're never gonna be that guy that has their heel down and their knee on the wall when they're 5 inches away. Not happening. Um, but you do want to maximize their ability to give them room to breathe. So I would say those people tend to be a lot more of an Achilles risk just because that's their primary motor. They've probably accrued a lot of stiffness over the years just from that. Um, these also have those happen to also be your fastest sprinters. Usain Bolt fall in that category for sure. When it comes to ligaments, I tend to view the rear foot archetype as being the most scary to me because when you use spirals, you tend to wind yourself a lot. And in my case, the reason why I check their rotation capabilities throughout the course of the season, I feel like if you're lacking some somewhere, you're going to gain it somewhere else. And so in our movement system, in absorption, the joint actions that are associated with absorption are dorsiflexion and pronation at the foot and ankle complex, tibial internal rotation, knee flexion, hip flexion, internal rotation, and adduction. So that has to happen in synchrony because if I internally rotate my hip more than I internally rotate my tibia, I've got relative tibia external rotation. That is knee abduction. That's a dangerous position for them to be stopping hard in. So if I'm lacking movement at the knee, if I'm lacking IR at the knee and I'm getting more from the hip, I got a problem. If I'm lacking IR at the hip, I can compensate through adduction at the hip as well. I got a problem. Um, so those are people that to me are most susceptible to to ligamentous injuries just based on the amount of rotation they go through and how in sync that chain has to be for that the rotation to be clean, right? Um, so I have zero data points on that. I could be argued with up and down, but just the way I'm describing these people moving, um, that's where my mind tends to go on what they might be more susceptible to.
Nice, nice. I like it. I like it. Think that's all the question I have for you today. I appreciate that, man.
No problem, dude. I'm always happy to be on here, so I appreciate you asking me.